Are we morally obliged to care for our elders? Welcome to an original exploration of everyday moral dilemmas with philosopher Dr. Clancy Martin and spiritual guide Daji. It is projected that by 2050, the world's population of people aged 60 years and older will double. As people get older, their needs change. Their capabilities also change. What then is our duty towards the elderly in our society?
The most famous philosopher to address this question in the Eastern tradition is certainly Confucius. And in the Confucian tradition, the elders in a society, the elderly, are really considered to be the fundamental source of moral guidance, the fundamental source of moral authority. And so all of the goodness of a society in terms of the knowledge, our acquaintance with goodness, comes from the elderly. So in the Confucian tradition, one of the fundamental moral duties that we have is reverence for the old, and particularly reverence for our own parents. In the West, there is a similar strain of thought, which really starts with the great Greek poet Homer. In Homeric thought, our moral obligations to our parents were among our very most important moral obligations. One of the greatest sins one could commit, one of the greatest moral failings one could make, according to the ancient Greeks, was to lie to one's parents. That's why in Homer's wonderful story, the Odyssey, at the end, Homer illustrates what a kind of morally complicated character Odysseus actually is by having him fool his father when he first comes home and pretend to be someone other than himself, so that this kind of tension would be created. Oh my goodness, this fellow's actually going to dare, this fellow who has told a lot of lies on the way to getting back to his home, is actually going to dare, upon returning home, to lie to his own father, the greatest sin that one could commit. Of course, then he reveals the truth to his dad, and it adds a lot to the story, but it's why there is tension there, because for the ancient Greeks, you just simply never lied to your parents, particularly an adult lying to an aging parent is particularly egregious, particularly blameworthy. And then by the time we get to Socrates, this tradition is still very much in place, but Socrates explains it for us. And Socrates puts it quite simply and commonsensically, as Socrates tended to do when it came to moral wisdom. Socrates says, look, we wouldn't exist without our parents, first thing. So in some sense, you owe them everything. You have your life as a consequence of your parents. You would not be on this planet. You would not be in this body. You wouldn't have this genetic material. Socrates doesn't say that, but it remains true. It's the same basic argument. None of this would be here if it weren't, I would not be here talking to you if it weren't for my mom and my dad. So, given that I would not be alive without them, I owe them my life. I owe them everything that has come to me as a consequence of my life. Therefore, at some level, anything I do for them, I'm still returning them less than I have. So we ought to do everything we can, Socrates says, for our elderly parents, because we owe them literally everything. In a similar line, the 19th century Buddhist philosopher Patrul Rinpoche points out, look, as he says, you could carry your aging mother on your shoulder your entire life, from the time you were born until the time you die, and you still wouldn't even begin to repay the debt you have to her. Why is that? Because without her, you would not be alive at all. So the moral obligation there is extremely robust. But Socrates doesn't stop there. He says, look, who raised you, who gave you your values, who fed you, who gave you your clothing, who gave you your education, who everything that you have become is a consequence of the fact that you were raised by these people. So now you are going to say, well, now they're getting old, now they need me. All those years I needed them. All those years I relied on them. All those years I couldn't have, fed myself, clothed myself. If you have children yourself, you recognize that it's not such an easy task to raise a child. Children it can be very demanding. The patience your parents showed you, the constant nurturing and care that they gave you, all that has made you who you are today. And if you have some share of happiness, adjustment, and place in the world, you owe that to your parents. It's your parents who created that for you. Without them, you wouldn't have those things.
While the ancient traditions of both the East and the West emphasize the duty children have to take care of their elderly parents, yet we find that aged parents are often not looked after.
In the East, we understand that the soul, before its conception, before it is incarnated, is attracted to its future parents due to its resonance. The vibratory level of the soul, if it finds that these parents are matching, it will select that womb and descend in that womb. So, children are actually selecting the parentage. In the line of that thought, we understand that our parents have not been thrust upon us, as one often hears in the West. People are heard saying, I choose my friends but not my family. It's a sad thing. Such a statement to an Eastern mind would sound quite absurd. We chose our parents even before we were conceived, remember that. The sacred Indian texts speak of reverence for mother and father in very specific terms, not mere respect, not mere honor, but reverence. Earlier, respect for parents was deeply embedded in Indian families. We considered taking care of our parents to be our moral duty and a matter of pride. Sadly, today, many aged parents find themselves left to the care of strangers in old age homes. Ask yourself, did your parents leave you in the hands of strangers even more than few hours in a day? Something to reflect on. The natural and automatic support system that was present earlier gave the grandchildren a possibility to be brought up with the caring wisdom of the grandparents, which was emotionally and mentally a very healthy trend. The new generation is growing up in an environment where the generational gap is increasing manifold. This also makes living together rather constraining for children who prefer to move away from their parents and live on their own as early as possible. To reverse this trend or understand just how important it is to be able to take care of one's parents, it is also important that parents confer quality time and attention to their children when they are very young. An atmosphere of love and harmony created in the home will have an effect on the children's behavior without any need to instruct or speak. They would learn by observation of the elders. The roots of such wise traditions are built by direct experience rather than enforced rules. Ask anyone who is given a terminal illness where they would rather spend the time that is left to them. Most answers will be that I would like to spend time with my family, children, parents, spouse, or in some spiritual solace. Very rarely would that person think of spending time at the office or elsewhere. All other ambitions pale in comparison. And in such a situation, we realize just what a precious gift life is. Life's pricelessness becomes painfully evident all of a sudden when we realize that it is our parents due to whom we have received such a precious gift. What would our attitude to them be like in such moments? Well, it gives us a lot to think about. It is best not to wait for such a dramatic thing to happen, as wisdom would nudge us to do good by them while we can. When it's too late, we'll regret.
Now, if we fast forward a long ways, 2,300 years or so, to the beginning of the 20th century, there's an American philosopher by the name of William James who could be helpful, particularly to Western thinking about this topic when we do prize these, where we do prize these values of individuality, creativity, youthfulness, entrepreneurship, all things that qualities we may no longer be able to rely upon as we are aging, and qualities that may bring conflicts between the young and the old, between parents and their children, because it isn't very helpful to your mom to say, come on, mom, show some self-reliance. Even if at a certain point in your life, maybe she said that to you. Come on, son, come on, daughter, show some self-reliance. Well, for William James' basic philosophical position has come to be called pragmatism. And the idea is that we shouldn't have rules that we apply onto experience when we're thinking about how to live a good life, among other things for James. James thought pragmatism extended beyond the moral life into other philosophical domains, such as the quest for truth. And he thought that science, in fact, revealed to us that sort of approaching the world with humility, approaching our experience with humility to see what emerges rather than trying to impose our ideas on experience or on the world around us, would actually be a more reliable guide. So for James, when it came to morality, similarly, we should kind of try as much as possible to cultivate an openness towards our own experience and see what, practically speaking, might be the best thing to do, what kind of solutions present themselves to us. And James thought we should also, and his fellow American philosopher John Dewey also argued the same thing, that also when it comes to social policy, we should think in this way. We should kind of open ourselves to the possibilities presented to us by our experience, the challenges and possible solutions. And so for James, he thought it's less helpful to say, oh, there is this duty that we all have to our parents. Why? Because parents differ and children differ. The moral responsibilities that fall upon a single child, an only child, might be very different than the responsibilities that fall upon a group of 4 or 5 children who have their own who have more resources that they could allocate to a parent or parents who are getting old, but also have debates that are going to take place between them about who's going to do what, etc. So this is an important thing, an important principle, I think, to remember, that morality in lots of contexts need not be so strict. This is what one must do. we can instead kind of cultivate an attitude of, practically speaking, how can we solve the problems that are in front of us? What are mom's needs? How can I meet some of those needs? Are there other ways to meet some of those other needs? And when it comes to social policy, okay, the elderly, we can discern a set of needs that are probably also changing. That's part of the appeal of pragmatism, is our elderly parents' needs will change as they get older. When our elderly parents are in their late 70s or early 70s, let's say, their needs may be more emotional, intellectual. They may need more social interaction with us. But then as they get older, their needs may become increasingly physical, and our obligations may shift according to their needs. The ways in which we are seeking the good for them, while at the same time trying to maintain good lives ourselves, will have to have this kind of flexibility that William James advocates when it comes to thinking about moral philosophy. So I think this attitude of pragmatism can be very useful when we're thinking about the moral responsibilities we have to our aging parents. And all of us want to be good children, we want to be good people.
But what if, in taking care of my parents, with my resources and my time, I am harming my own career or making my spouse and my children unhappy?
You can divorce your spouse, but you cannot divorce your parents. It's a beautiful truth, and I'm glad it is that way. Independent lifestyles are glorified in our present-day culture. Children at a very young age start thinking of independence as an important achievement that indicates becoming adults. From entire communities that shared everything and lived in deep connection with each other, we went on to living in joint families and then on to nuclear families. Now, we find monoparental families. They are cropping up more and more as divorce rates soar higher and higher, even here in the East. Interconnectedness, to me, is of a higher value than independence. Morality, to me, is all about utilization of energy, personal resources, including time, in exact doses. Our heart sends us signals whenever we do something that is not right in any given situation, that it starts pumping faster or becomes heavier. We feel uncomfortable with ourselves, and the complexities that arise out of it makes us disturbed. Meditation, as prescribed and practiced in heartfulness way, it really helps us tune into the heart with increased sensitivity and receptivity to the signals that comes from outside. Why be sensitive? Only when you are sensitive you are able to perceive. So that happens because of this meditation. Each time we end up abiding by the heart's signal, the end result is always of inner contentment. It is when we do not listen to the heart that we regret. The question arises whether we are doing too much or too less does not come up when we follow the heart. We can dose, accurately measure our energies and attention with growing precision towards our obligations, no more or no less, with a sense of non-attachment, avoiding pools of fear and desire. The great philosopher William James is an ethical subjectivist. In the Eastern philosophical traditions, the concept of dharma is also subjective and evolves with inner as well as outer situations. Performing your dharma implies that there is a right or a true way for each person to carry out their life in order to serve both themselves and others. All this guidance comes from within, from the heart. Deep introspection is an essential skill. It is all related to one's dharma in life. How to determine the dharma, what is my duty at any given moment? We need to reflect, go within, introspect, meditate, and come to your own conclusion. The same rule may not apply in every situation. Dharma is closely related to the concept of duty and selfless services. Although it can be a challenging concept to grasp since it has no precise English translation, or a close interpretation of this term would relate to following a right way of living. That's all. Right way of living. The word dharma originates from Sanskrit root word called dri. It means to hold, to behold the truth, to maintain, or to preserve the highest principle. In the Vedic texts, dharma referred to this principle that created the ordered universe from chaos to orderliness. Later, it was applied to the other contexts, including human behaviors and ways of living that prevent society, family, and nature from descending into chaos. So, in a way, preventing anything from entering into chaos, that lifestyle can be called dharmic. This included the concept of following one's duties, rights, religion, and morally appropriate behavior. And so the dharma came to be understood as a means to preserve and maintain righteousness instead of an objective interpretation of morality or appropriate demeanor. Now, science meets the ancient Vedic wisdom when quantum physicists discovered the subjective reality of the universe and started deciphering their discoveries in formula that are applicable to microcosm or infinitely small particles that make up the matter. The observer determines the way these particles behave, or is the wave function collapses when it is being observed into a particle. To me, when we summarize all these things, home is the training ground. That is where we learn values like love and sacrifice. Actually, the idea of sacrifice will not cross your mind when you are in love. Later, this care and share attitude spills over in the community and nature at large. So when we are taking care of our families, our children, our elders, we do know where and how much we need to balance our priorities in an intrinsic manner if we have this capacity to develop inner clarity. Such clarity is achievable and it can be applicable in a day-to-day life. Just a mere shift in consciousness, a little bit of sensitivity is required, and this can be heightened with introspection and meditation.
Now, another question raises itself, which is most of us had kind, loving parents who, with all the failings, of course, and mistakes that parents make, parents are people too, they make lots of mistakes, they have their failures. Nevertheless, most of us feel like, yeah, we had basically good upbringings. Maybe we would have liked some changes here or there. But what about those of us who didn't have good parents, who had bad parents, who even had abusive parents, or who had really, really traumatic childhoods as a consequence of their parents. And now these aging parents who were neglectful, now they have needs. Do we have any moral obligation to those people in our lives who continue to be in our lives? Or what if you feel like you had one really good parent and one really bad parent? Would it be morally appropriate to only take care of the good one and not the bad one, as we might like to do, as we might be emotionally inclined to do? Well, our emotions are always morally relevant, and we should remember that. Part of what we are trying to articulate in these conversations is a robust connection between our emotional lives and our moral lives. And when people distinguish between the two, I think that is a real failing and a real confusion in the way a flourishing life ought to be led. A flourishing life is not just a rational life, it is also an emotional life, obviously. In fact, most of our happiness probably is much more closely tethered to our emotional lives than it is to our rational lives. And contemporary cognitive science and psychology bears this intuition out. So what about these kids of abusive parents, or one abusive parent? Well, again, from the perspective of the history of philosophy, here we may have a first moral obligation both to that parent and to ourselves, which is a kind of moral obligation to forgive and forget. We know that how we ourselves can heal from the pain of the past and how we can help others morally progress beyond the pain of the past. An important part of that is forgiveness, and as the old maxim goes, part of forgiveness is often to forget, to let go. And as the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche remarked, forgetfulness is not a merely passive force, as people sometimes naively suppose. It's an active force that is essential to the psychological health of the human being. Any human being who tried to remember everything, who clung to everything of the past, wouldn't be able to live in the present and wouldn't be able to move forward in a productive way into the future of her life. So that's the first thing that probably should be said. Now, moral obligations above and beyond that. Here again, I think William James, the pragmatism of William James is helpful. We should think about how we can balance our own flourishing with the needs of that person who maybe wasn't a good parent, but still provided us with life and probably provided us with some other things that we may not want emotionally to acknowledge because of the bad things that happened to us in our childhood. As much as possible, it seems like we should try to seek the good for that person, try to help that person as best we can. And there are limits. This, again, a Jamesian point. It could be that it is just too difficult for us to help that particular person, in which case, from James's perspective, okay, practically speaking, it's just not possible. Someone else is going to have to do this work. And then on, from James' perspective, that's a morally legitimate position. There's sometimes the abuse was just such that you don't feel like any moral obligation exists there anymore. And I think we can say, yeah, under some circumstances that's perfectly morally legitimate position to take. There are times at which people do things to one another where we'll say any kind of moral obligation that existed between ourselves and that particular person no longer exists because we have been too wronged. And still, in that circumstance, if only for our own flourishing, forgiveness is no doubt appropriate, but that doesn't mean there has to be an ongoing relationship.
Well, before we really enter into philosophical details, I wish you to recall the popular American televised sitcom series, Everybody Loves Raymond. In the series, the character of the mother tends to overcare one for the other. Ray is pampered while Robert is always on a critical zone. This can surely be called abuse of maternal instinct, however innocent. These hilarious episodes on television are a portrayal of deep wounds that many families bear. One can witness the psychological impact on a disadvantaged sibling. It is not just siblings who are treated with partiality by the mother or father, but the rest of the family too get caught up in the drama, eventually paying for this atrocity in some way or the other. Such patterns, they display a broad emotional spectrum with which many families are able to identify themselves. The abused Robert in this series is always with the parents, while the Ray, who is over cared for, remains at a distance from parents. One wonders at such a psychological twist. Please think for a moment. What goes through your mind when you dislike that person whom you are forced to see and meet and entertain? When we compare this with a child's situation, who is exposed to abusive parents 24/7, do you think such a child likes to be in that company? So, this is an interesting question that makes us see the ugliness of the modern society that challenges us for a practical solution. There seems to be an obsession with this phenomena not only in the Western countries but in the East as well. In face of an abuse, it is vital to first and foremost know it well. Convince your heart that it is not your fault. Convince yourself that their pattern of behavior of such parents is due to their own past accumulations or whatever they have, and that as the victim of abuse, you have nothing to do with that. Creating such a protective emotional barrier can help the abuse to a large extent, knowing well that it's not your fault. Of course, one surely would also feel an extent of empathy for parents who are abusive, not realizing that their actions would leave such a terrible emotional scar on their children due to their actions. If one really wants to take a revenge, there is no better way than returning abuse with love. Think for a moment. Abusive parents, especially in the case of children at a very young age, can create a pattern of hurt that later on in life can lead to dire psychological consequences. How to deal with emotions that result from this kind of deep abuse? Can we actually override that and be kind towards an abusive parent with the same moral obligations that we feel toward a caring and loving parent? Abused ones develop a mistrust towards majority, having failed with parents who were trusted completely. Moving on from the case of Raymond, let's look at some prevalent forms of abuse together, just how devastating the effects of such actions can be. There are so many ways in which abuse happens. Forced feeding a very young child is like overriding the little one's inner compass. When a child does not want to eat and when you force them to eat, is this not an abuse of some sort? There are times when parents give the children the silent treatment. They ignore the child to show that they are not living up to their expected behavior from parents. This is very immature. This is even worse than physical harm. Another card that parents sometimes use and which leaves a deep scar on the child's mind with a lot of guilt and shame is that the victim card. When parents say things like, "Oh, see, it is because of you that I am in such a situation," the child takes up these feelings and feel guilty about the whole situation. Of course, there is the classical situation of physical abuse when parents threaten to beat up a child or actually do so. Psychological abuse is just as violent. Take, for example, the case of parents comparing siblings, like in case of Ray and Robert, or favoring one child over the other. It is so demeaning for the children. At times, such criticism that sounds so negative is terribly harmful. Like when parents make statements such as, "You always do this, you don't listen." Even when children grow up, parents can continue to be abusive towards them. Have you not heard often enough parents saying things like, "If you do not take care of me or do as I say, then I'll have you excluded from my inheritance. Your sister or brother is better at this, and I would likely leave everything to them." Another terrible manner of abuse is especially seen in divorced families. This is manifested by emotional disconnect. Just to please your newfound toy in the form of your new partner or spouse, you do not look after your children so well that attention towards them somehow fails. Instead, caught up in the new relationship, you somehow choose to disconnect yourself from your children just to satisfy your new partner. Sadly, this is rather a common pattern in divorced families. Using guilt tripping or humiliation is observed in many families. The love of parents is supposed to be unconditional, isn't it? How then can it be a manipulative force? A mother's love, especially, is supposed to be always unconditional. There is no question of a reward mechanism there or the use of bargain in love and affection. So, how come we begin using such things in our relationship with our own children? Abuse also occurs when parents use their power to continue to ensure that children remain dependent on them. I have also observed that parents at times blame their children for having sacrificed a successful career or missing out on certain opportunities in life. This choice is entirely the parent's own, and by expressing it in this manner to the child, it can create a terrible feeling of guilt, especially when parents blame their children for a failed marriage. Such a blame can create one of the worst feelings of unworthiness in the child. See? Sometimes abuse manifests in apparently positive things, such as when parents push their children to follow the lifestyle they themselves lead or to follow the faith that they have been inculcated from their early childhood. Have we not observed parents pushing their children to attend Sunday church or go for some group meditations? To my mind, pushing children in such a manner is a form of abuse too. Parents abusing each other can also be classified as abuse towards the children. This is much like a second-hand smoke that a child is subjected to. Abuse by parents towards children of a very young age, or a teenager, or an adult will have a different implication in their psyche. Out of these, the worst is when you are affected as a child. A teenager can, at least in some manner, manifest his or her anger and do not permit the negative to settle in their mind. They let go of it to a large extent. They are quite capable of reacting violently to the abuse of parents. The question is, should one shut the doors once and for all on such parents? Should one try to forgive? We are often engaged in debates on forgiving and forgetting when considering such situations. Each situation is so unique that it demands a careful study before one can mindlessly end up offering any healing concoctions. I would not dare to. Solutions are difficult to find because even if you want to forgive, past memory doesn't let you. For it is perhaps to a certain extent possible to forgive, but to forget is a whole lot different thing. It is practically impossible. More one tries to forget, somehow it deepens its roots in our psyche, in our subconscious. How to deal with all this remains a big question mark. Many believe that forgiving would help them and find closure. But then the idea of justification rises in the heart. Should such abusing tyrants be forgiven at all? Emotions versus rational are considered epic standoffs. But are they? Yes, under the most situations, emotions and logic, heart and mind sync well. Standoffs, they are felt only when things are at crossroads with each other. The heart says to let go of all that happened once upon a time. Yet there is a lingering feeling of otherwise. Mind says no. Often one even feels like taking revenge later on in life when there has been childhood abuses. But that kind of behavior can have other legal consequences. We do not want to put ourselves in such a situation, you see. In any case, will punishing someone solve my past? Emotional scars are very tough to heal. Anger, fear, restlessness, frustrations, difficult to let go of. All these energy vibrations do find their place on a particular chakra where these vibrations tend to settle, creating a further complexities and impurities in the field of consciousness. When the field of consciousness is supposed to give us the perfect compass, now, due to settlement of these complexities and impurities, one loses the true compass. Even when the answer may be glaring at their face, lack of courage and fearfulness often takes over. When desires to punish someone creeps up in the heart, or the ego says, how could I have been treated like this and I got to do something about it? Under those circumstances, we generally lose our compass because of this anger. So, is there any other solution to erase these emotional scars? Everything in life has a raison d'etre, even the most tragic and difficult situations, where forgetting actually may not be easier. We can, with yogic practices, learn to be forgiving to a certain extent, however difficult it may seem. It is literally a way to get our body to get de-addicted from those emotions. In case of abuse from a parent where the pain is very difficult to get rid of, even with therapies and other means, with a spiritual practice such as the intensely practical method of heartfulness, cleaning, and rejuvenation, the past can truly be effaced to a large extent. At least its emotional impact will not trouble you as much.
But I think it's happily true that most of us had good parents, and most of us probably are not doing quite as much for our good parents as they age as maybe we ought to do. So we all, myself included, ought to think about that moral responsibility a little bit more, maybe do a little bit more. And if all of the governing philosophers virtually who have thought about this subject and all of the contemporary social science on the subject is right, we will find that as we help our parents more, that we will find that our elderly parents more, we will find that this contributes to our own flourishing as well. And we should also probably bear in mind Aristotle's principle of moderation there. Confucius also argued for a principle of moderation. His notion was that there was a fundamental harmony in the universe, and that our goal was to be maximally good. The goal was to kind of establish ourselves within that harmony. And that harmony is governed by metaphors of balance, of moderation, like Aristotle suggests. Aristotle and Confucius have so much in common. So one doesn't want to become immoderate in seeking the good of an elderly parent, because then it will be difficult to do so in the long term. It will be difficult to maintain the other good relationships that are important in one's own life.
While both the East and West agree that one must look after aged parents, but as in other things, shouldn't one follow the principle of moderation? How do we know how much is enough?
I cannot say that I have reached my limits of serving them. They will be tragic when we say enough, I have done enough. That will be very wrong. In fact, when we miss out on an opportunity of serving such parents who showered their love, missing that when we know that they are no more, would you be able to say sorry to them? It will be a tragic moment for us too. We missed an opportunity, and for missing such an opportunity, rest of our life will be, pining with this guilt. Oh, I could not do something I could have done. Flipping the whole thing, once I heard Clancy speaking about the golden rule: do unto others what you would like to be done upon yourself. When you raise your own children, and as you grow older, you see your children and grandchildren, wouldn't you expect that they visit you at least now and then, if not 24/7? Are we at least doing that much? I think we have a tremendous responsibility towards our parents, and if they remain unhappy, thirsty, hungry for our love, then what is the point of leading such an existence full of luxury, full of peace and full of harmony? With whom are you creating this harmony? With your spouse, with your children? Is this your limited world? What happened to those who brought you into this world? So, fundamental thing, that if one has to create harmony within a family, and as a result in a community, in the whole world, this cannot happen unless and until we look after each other, starting with our own. Failing this, how will you say my community is happier? It's not possible. So it has a implicit impact of measuring, or it has implicit impact of measured doses of love towards parents or anybody else actually. One cannot say I have done enough or I have loved enough. When we bring such transaction that I have done enough, it's not my job, then we have shortchanged ourselves with the higher life that would have been waiting for us, having fulfilled my duties, what we in the East call dharma. I have fulfilled my dharma, I have fulfilled my duty, I have no more guilt in my heart. In fact, when I am able to do this for my parents, you can graduate beyond them and then cover others who needs the help of other younger ones in the society. The future will recognize our society and how we took care of our elderly citizens. When you also take your last breath, and when you'll be seeing yourself from above, all that you did on this planet, see that it makes you happy. May God bless us all in fulfilling our duties towards one and all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daji, for this wonderful conversation. And let's all try and do something nice for our moms and our dads. You know, sometimes it's in these conversations about what we owe our elderly parents, we particularly tend to talk about moms because, you know, they're moms, where they do a lot for us. But we shouldn't forget about our poor old dads. Dads probably did a lot for us too. So we should let's all try and do something nice for our moms and our dads, particularly if they're getting old. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daji, and thank you, Dr. Clancy Martin, for those valuable insights into this fascinating topic. Thank you also to our listeners and viewers for joining us. Do join us again for the next episode of Compass. Until then, goodbye.